So I went to a church called Temple Baptist, and I answered an altar call. And the guy who received me, one of the elders, said, "Would you like to accept Christ into your life?" And I said, "No, I want to give my life to Christ." My story has lots of twists and turns. I grew up in Sacramento. For the most part, I thought I had a normal childhood. I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, and I think my parents thought it was cool to give the first letter of all of our names and make it the same. So my oldest sister's Debbie, and then there's Danny, and then there's Denise, and there's Doug, and that's me. I came from a large family. I have 7 uncles and 1 aunt on my dad's side, so family gatherings were incredible. They were huge. Thanksgivings, Christmases, birthdays, we'd all get together, and I was right in the middle of the pack as far as the age group goes, and we're all different. But the one thing we all had in common is that we all went to Lutheran churches. When I was about 3 or 4 years old, my mom wrecked the car. Well, back then, seat belts weren't a thing. I was standing up in the back seat. There was no such thing as car seats even back then. She hit this curb, and I went flying from the back seat into the metal dash. I lost 3 of my front teeth that day. And in the first grade, my teacher discovered that I needed glasses. So here I am, a bright red-headed kid, wearing glasses and no front teeth. Oh, kids can be mean. It was devastating as a child. I was kind of used to it though, being the youngest of 4. My siblings gave me a hard time too. Little did I know, there were some life lessons that I would gather from that experience in my life later on. At one point, I realized too that we were poor. I didn't understand that until my dad lost his job and we had to go on food stamps. And then it dawned on me that most of my neighbors, well, all of my neighbors were poor. I grew up in a poor neighborhood. I was friends with all of my neighbors, and there was a diversity of people I grew up in, even just on my block. Black families, Asian families, Mexican families. At one point, I think I was like 7 or 8 years old, and my brother took me out to pick tomatoes. I didn't last long in that hot summer sun that first day of picking tomatoes, but I did it, not knowing what I was even going to get paid. As a matter of fact, I didn't get paid. My brother ended up keeping all the money I made picking tomatoes. So that was part of how I grew up. My dad was a traveling salesman, so he wasn't home very often. He did come home on the weekends to make sure that we went to church. And because we were poor, my mom had to work also. So my oldest sister ended up watching us. She was 7 years older than I am. And at the time, she was a kid. And, well, kids raising kids is not a good formula. She had the influence of the 60s in her life by the way she dressed, the way she talked, and she even started doing drugs at a fairly young age. And it was during that time when the Black Panther movement was happening. Again, we grew up in a very diverse neighborhood, and my best friend, a kid who lived across the street from me, Ronnie Mathis is his name, and he was a black kid, and I didn't think anything about racial diversity at the time. He was just my friend. His older brother was part of the Black Panthers and ended up tipping the car over that my sister was in. We were neighbors. I didn't understand how somebody could do that to a friend, a neighbor. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, we decided to move to Salt Lake City. And my older siblings did not come with us. Not a diverse ethnic community in Salt Lake City, mostly white people. I didn't know how really to fit in. Well, one thing led to another, and my mom developed a relationship, and my mom had found out that my dad had had an affair with the church secretary. Well, as you can imagine, their marriage ended. You don't really realize the impact that a divorce has on children. My parents made a decision, and it impacted me for the majority of my life. I was devastated. My mom ended up marrying. He decided that we should move to Las Vegas. Not a great place to raise kids. I was introduced to all kinds of things there as well that I probably shouldn't have been exposed to as a kid. Sharing a room with my stepbrother. He was a few years older than me, moved in with us. Being that he was older, he also had some older tendencies. He started smoking cigarettes. That influenced me. I started smoking at a young age. He liked alcohol and girls. I wasn't even thinking about girls at that age, but he'd talk about them incessantly. And my first year of high school was at Valley High. And that year was one of the biggest riots that school had ever seen. My dad heard about it, and he happened to be in Nova Scotia at the time, and sent me a postcard. First time I ever got a postcard from my dad. I still have it to this day, saying that he was hoping that I was okay, that he had heard about the riot. Several people were killed in that riot. But my life from that point was pretty rough. I was 14 years old when my mom decided that she didn't want me. Mainly it was my stepdad who didn't want me in their house anymore. So I had to move to Salt Lake City, where my sister was living with my brother, living in an apartment by ourselves, unsupervised. But I was smoking cigarettes on a fairly regular basis at that point. I was drinking alcohol. I started experimenting with drugs, and we had pretty much free reign to do whatever we wanted to do. My dad would show up once a month to pay rent and buy us groceries. At that point, I realized I better get a job if I wanted any disposable income. So I took a job at a little convenience store gas station. But that was where I was at in life, and I thought, no parental supervision, what kid wouldn't love this? Well, without support from your parents, life can get sideways pretty fast at that age, and mine did. My sister had some bad influences on her life as well, and she talked us into robbing the gas station. I didn't want to have anything to do with it, but I was part of the plan. I had to be working the cash register when they came in to rob the store. And fortunately, I didn't get caught. But the role models we have in life are important. And unfortunately for me, I had bad role models. So one night I was drinking, and I decided it'd be a good idea to steal my sister's car. I didn't have a driver's license, didn't know how to drive. Nobody had ever taught me. But I thought, that's a good idea. Go for a joyride. I ended up totaling that vehicle. You'd think one devastating experience in your life because of drinking would stop, or give you time to pause and reflect. It didn't. I thought after my sister showed me how to rob somebody, I decided it would be a good idea to rob my neighbor. So I talked my sister's boyfriend into robbing my neighbor. Of course, I got caught, and I ended up going to jail. Juvenile hall. They put me in solitary confinement. I did not know anything about the mafia, but this young lady that we robbed was tied to the mafia. And so the police officer said they were putting me in solitary confinement for my protection. I'm sitting in jail in solitary confinement. My dad came to visit me and told me that him and his new wife were going to move to Lodi, California. So we go to court, my dad's there, and my dad says that he's moving to Lodi, California, and that he'd be happy to take me with him. And the judge said, you can take the kid with you, but he can't come back to Utah for 3 years. I'd never even heard of anybody getting kicked out of a state before, but that's what ended up happening. So my dad had remarried. He married a Mormon lady. He had literally changed from being a Lutheran to a Mormon to marry this lady. I don't know if you know much about the Mormon church, but there are 12 apostles in the Mormon church, and the woman he married was one of the daughters of the 12. So for him to be able to marry her, he had to convert to Mormonism. So we moved to Lodi, California, but she didn't want me in the house. So my dad built a space for me in the garage. It was so bad living there that she put a padlock on the refrigerator and changed the lock in the garage so I couldn't get into the house unless she allowed me. So I didn't have access to food on a regular basis. But I thought, well, my dad's Mormon now, not a Lutheran, so maybe I'll do some reading on what Mormons are. So I picked up a book called The Pearl of Great Price, written by Joseph Smith. And that started me on a journey of reading about other world religions, about Muslims, about Buddhists. I started practicing transcendental meditation. I looked into all kinds of world religions. But my life didn't change. I kept doing drugs. I'm a junior in high school. And one of my friends, his dad was a dentist, and he was able to get some Demerol. For those of you who know, it's kind of the painkiller that doctors give you. And back then, Quaaludes were popular, and I had access to getting Quaaludes. In other words, my life was a mess. I was trying to kill the pain through drugs. I didn't understand that at the time, but that's what I was doing. So one night, my friend decided we're going to drop some acid and wash it down with whiskey. And then we decided, brilliant idea, let's go on a road trip. We're on acid and drinking. And it's getting late at night at this point, and the fog's beginning to roll in, and we're about Rio Vista. Not quite, but right in there. He's so high that he can't drive anymore, and he asked me if I would drive. Well, I've never driven a stick shift before, but he said he'd explain it to me. So I get in the driver's seat, and I'm driving, and he's explaining how to get through the gears, and I'm in first, second, third, fourth gear. We're going about 65 miles an hour. It's pretty dark at this point. And we come to a 35-mile-an-hour corner. Well, he'd never explained to me how to downshift. So we took that 35-mile-an-hour corner about 65 miles an hour. We launched off that curve. From what the police told me the next day, we flipped the vehicle 3 times end over end and 3 times rolling it sideways. We were both thrown from the vehicle, but because I was on the driver's side, I hit the steering wheel and then went through the front windshield with my face. I remember waking up and feeling a bunch of pain, but I knew I had to find my friend. It was dark, it was foggy. Because it was a construction site, there were porta potties, and I needed to find someplace warm. So I went into the porta potty. I put my hands on my neck, not knowing that I was bleeding from my neck, but it was the warmest space on my body. So I put my hands there. This is my first God moment. I realized the next day, that I had coagulated the blood that was dripping from my neck with the mud and the blood gathered in that spot. I wake up and I hear this sound. And I thought, somebody's here. I can get help. It was the police. They had noticed that a car had gone off that corner. And I'm walking and it's still foggy. And I go to yell. What I didn't know is I had broken 4 of my ribs. If you try and take a deep breath when you have broken ribs, you really don't get much air. I went to go yell and this is what came out. Help! But somebody heard me. They came running up to me. Their faces were in shock, but I didn't realize it at the time why they were so shocked. And they said, was anybody else with you? And I started saying, Lauren, my friend Lauren. They found him. They put us in an ambulance. They took us to the nearest hospital. My eyelid was cut in half, 62 stitches, to sew my eyelid back in my eye. I still have the scars today on my chin. My face looked like a smashed pumpkin. My jaw was hanging down. They didn't discover that I had a broken jaw, so I had to go get surgery done on my face to wire my jaw back together. They wire your teeth when you have a broken jaw. I was convinced that no girl would ever like me again. I went to school for 2 or 3 days, and I just told my dad, I can't do it. I had a liquid diet, and so my dad, being a traveling salesman, said, you're going to hit the road with me. You know how hard it is to get restaurants to puree food? But I found that most people, after they saw me, were amicable to do that for me. So I would get roast beef sandwiches, mashed potatoes and gravy, and apple pie, all blended up with milk. And that's how I ate for 3 months as my jaw was wired together. I lost a bunch of weight. I looked terrible. It was devastating. And I was pretty convinced there was no God at that point in my life. Because how could God allow stuff like this to happen? Well, that summer, my dad moved. He didn't even tell me he was moving. He left a box by the garage door, and I was homeless. I still had to finish school, and here I was. My mom's husband didn't want me back with them. I had no place to go and nowhere anybody that would take me in, so I asked my friend, who I hung out with quite a bit, if I could stay at his house for a couple days. His mom was a miracle in my life. Her name was Pat Lynch. Some of you listening to this might know her. She took in a lot of us over the years, and I was one more, but I didn't know how benevolent she was. Her and her husband made a space for me in their house. I lived there during the summer, and my sister, my oldest sister, calls me up. She had gotten married at a very young age, and then a divorce, but she had 2 kids during that marriage, and she wanted me to fly them out to Colorado. She lived in Colorado Springs. Flew into Denver. My sister picks me up. I get her children to her. We get there, and I'm like, okay, where do I stay? And her new husband wasn't real thrilled that I was even going to stay there. It didn't last long. I found myself homeless in Colorado Springs. I was living on park benches. I was staying, doing the sofa circuit. At one point, near Manitou, there's a bridge, and there's a cave near this bridge, and I stayed in the cave. I found out how the system worked. There were soup kitchens that were open early in the morning and soup kitchens that were open late at night. There were clothes closets where people were giving away clothes. And so I strategized how I was going to live my life. I would eat at this soup kitchen mid-morning because I didn't want to have to get up early. And I'd eat at that one, the other one, as late as it possibly could. And what I found out during my time as a homeless person in Colorado, that some of these folks had jobs, but they'd rather spend their money on drugs than housing. And this was a pivotal moment in my life. I was working day labor. You'd get there early, and hopefully if you got there early enough, you'd get the lottery and you'd be one of the people that got chosen for a job. One of those jobs was cleaning the air vents in the kitchen. I was happy just to have a job. And what I ended up having to do was I had to crawl in and scrape the grease off the vents and put it into the bucket. By the time I was done cleaning the grease out of the vents, I am covered in grease. They were gracious enough to feed me lunch that day. They had steak, and they had eggs, and they had all kinds of different kinds of food. I ate like a king that day. It was phenomenal. I got a fat paycheck at the end of the day, and I thought, I need to take a shower. So I rented a motel room, and it was the first time I had had a hot shower in what seemed like months. But that night, after that hot shower and sleeping on a nice, comfortable bed in a nice, warm room, I decided that I never wanted to be homeless again. But that meant going back to school. So that means I have to call my mom. I hadn't talked to my mom in years. So I call my mom and I ask her if I could come live with her so I could finish high school. Well, my mom agreed to sign me up to school, but she told me I had to work. So, took a day job working at a car wash. It was one of the best jobs I'd ever had in my life. People from the shows would come in. So the showgirls, the entertainers, comedians, and we'd detail their cars and we'd hail the customer. And as they're walking up, you're doing some finishing detail work and hopefully you'd get a tip. Again, living in Las Vegas, going to night school. And then my mom and her husband decided to move to Reno. And of course, there's a huge question mark in my mind whether I get to go with them or not. But they said yes. I had been sleeping on their sofa, but in their new place, I got my own room. So I got a daytime job working at Reno Dodge as a lot boy. It was a fantastic job. I think I was getting $5.25 an hour. This is back in 1977. That was good money for me as a high school student. I do that during the day, and I go to school at night at Washoe High, which is Reno High's night school. I'm 17 years old. The oldest person in my class of about 20 is 63. So underachievers and overachievers, and then there was me. Halfway through the last part of my senior year, my parents kicked me out again. They're going to move to Tahoe, and I wasn't welcome to come with them. But I figured I've got a job, I'm about ready to graduate from high school, and I'll figure it out. But I can't blame my parents. I was using drugs, I was an alcoholic. Some of this was on me, but I didn't want to take ownership of it. I ended up graduating with my class. I don't know how. That year, I dropped acid 250 days of that year, 360 days a year. I was on acid all the time. I was broken. I couldn't find relief from my life situations, no matter how hard I tried to escape. At that point, I thought maybe a relationship. And oh my gosh, I had so many relationships, more than I can count. But there was no satisfaction there either. My brother called me up. He was an entrepreneur, and he thought that I should move to Stockton, California to start a business there with him. He would back it financially, and I would operate. When I got to Stockton, he let me stay in his office, sleeping on a sofa again. I was so tired of that style of life. It didn't come to fruition. I had to get a job. So I started working at a 7-Eleven. And then I got a job at a record store, record factory on March Lane. I ended up getting a girl pregnant. I was 21 years old, and my hopes of going to college were gone. I knew I had to take care of a child soon. I had 9 months to get my act together. Working at the record store, they wanted me to take a job in Lodi. I did not have fond memories of Lodi, and there was no way I wanted to manage a record store in Lodi. So I quit, and I started working at 7-Eleven again. I was swing shift. I didn't own a car at the time. At this point in my life, I had totaled probably 4 or 5 vehicles, all drunk driving. I was lucky to be alive. So I'm walking to work, swing shift, and the guy who was relieving me was a part-time pastor. He worked, filled some of his income, and he said, "Are you going to go to heaven when you die?" And I said, "I think so. I'm a pretty good guy." I knew enough about the Bible that I knew that I didn't murder anybody. I lied now and again, but who doesn't? Hadn't committed adultery because I wasn't married. And I went down the list in my head and told him, "I'm a pretty good guy. I think I will." And he goes, "How would you like to know for sure?" And I said, "Yes." And he shared the gospel with me, that I need to confess that Jesus Christ is Lord and believe in him with my whole heart, and I'll be saved. And then I contemplated it because I had read books on religion. But one thing I discovered as I was studying world religions, that Jesus Christ is the only one whose bones aren't in the grave. He claimed he had risen, and people had seen him rise from the grave. Buddha, all of the Buddhas, Muhammad, all world religions, none of them claimed to have been resurrected except for Jesus Christ. And I knew that. And I knew there was something there. I said yes, and he prayed with me, the sinner's prayer. And the only way I can describe the sensation or feeling I got at that moment was if I had a backpack of rocks that were lifted off me. I felt a freedom I hadn't felt since I was a child. I felt like I had made the right decision. I made a good decision. I hadn't been making good decisions, but this one was a good one. And then he started speaking in tongues. And it freaked me out. I'm like, what did I just do? I didn't know anything about tongue talkers. I didn't know anything about prayer language. I didn't know anything about any of that. But I did share with my sister, who had become a Christian, my youngest sister, Denise, and she sent me a Bible. And I started just kind of looking at it, not really reading it seriously, but I was interested. First time I had cracked open a Bible since I was in Sunday school as a kid. But it was there. Just having it there brought me comfort. And I can't really explain how that happened. But I knew my life was changing. I had a child on the way. And the overwhelming thought was, because this is what was modeled for me, is I need to take my child to church. So I went to a church called Temple Baptist. And I answered an altar call. And the guy who received me, one of the elders, said, "Would you like to accept Christ into your life?" And I said, "No, I want to give my life to Christ." He didn't know what to do with that answer. Nobody probably had ever said that before, that they want to give their life to Christ, not accept him. I'd already done that. But I didn't know where to go from there. I was college age, so I was going to their college group, and the college leader kind of took me under his wing. And he shared with me that him and his wife were going to go on a missions trip. It was Teen Missions International. And I thought, I'm going to sign up, and I'm going to go where he goes. But I had to go to Florida and do training before I could be a team leader. I go to Florida, and there's 1,000 kids. They had 2 boot camps. And I'm doing the leadership stuff. I'm going into a prayer closet. They had us do that 1 hour every day. And I began to look forward to that hour. At first I thought, an hour, how am I going to pray for an hour? But they have a whole list of things you can pray for on this wall, and people and needs and whatnot, the teams. An hour went by really fast. That was a discovery I hadn't had previously. You could spend an hour talking to God and it goes by really fast. So I'm doing this stuff and I'm interacting with the students. They're all high school kids. And this kid was acting abnormal. Like, I'd seen strange before as homeless guy, and I've been in enough places in my lifetime at that point that I pretty much thought I had seen everything. But this guy was like, he talked with a different sound in his voice. One time it would be deep, rough, and the other time it would be like what I would consider normal. And one of our leaders at Teen Missions, she was from the South, and everybody called her Widder. Well, if you've ever been to the South, you know that a widow is a widder. And she's saying things like, "Jeet yet?" And I'd say, "No, Jew." So it was like shorthand. I didn't know I'm learning this new language. I became good friends with the Widder. And one night I'm walking down a path going back to my tent that I was staying in Florida. Humid, hot, alligators. There she is in the middle of the road. The moon's coming down, illuminating them. And she's interacting with this kid who had two different voices. And she's in the process of something I had never seen before. The only time I ever heard of it was a movie called The Exorcist. And she is casting a demon out of this young man. I stand back. I'm not approaching. I stand back and observe what's happening. And when she prayed a prayer, and I'm not sure what she said or how she did it, but the demeanor, body language of this young man changed dramatically. And he fell on his knees. I felt it was safe to approach at that point. I did. And the kid was crying. And he said, "Thank you to the Widder for delivering him." She explained to me that she cast out a demon. I just read about this stuff. I thought it was in movies. But I saw it. It was miraculous. I can't tell you what that does to one's faith when you see a miracle take place right in front of you. Something that's unexplainable, something that I didn't quite understand. But I realized I needed to read the Bible cover to cover. And I had finished at the end of my missions trip to Ireland, where we built a fantastic facility for a youth camp. We did a high ropes course. My job was to put in a septic tank dug by hand. To get to Ireland, though, was a bit of a challenge. We all stayed in tents, and there were about 15 of us, and we needed 25 tents. Well, we get to Heathrow Airport. We go to a place called Pillar of Fire, and that's where they had our tents. But the people who were going to drop off the tents for our team hadn't dropped them off yet. So our team already had travel plans to get to Ireland. And my team leader said, "You stay behind. When the tents come, you bring them." Seemed simple. 25 tents for one person. I was in pretty good shape, but I'm telling you, it was a bit of a feat. I make my travel plans to sail across the Irish Sea, get to Dublin, and then find a ride to a place called Wicklow, where the youth camp was at. I can't tell you how much God interceded. 3 train changes, a boat ride, 2 taxis, trying to lug 25 tents by myself. I'm late to get to one train. I have to run to the next platform. People helped me with the tents as they saw that I was in need of help. Getting to the boat, I was late because my trains were late. Getting onto the boat, people helped me with my tents. I'd carry 2 and somebody else would grab the 3rd one. It was magical to me, if I can use that term, because I didn't know how quite to describe the miracle that God was performing and allowing me to get to my team with all the tents. One person, 25 tents. I wrote that down in my journal because I never wanted to forget it, how God had interceded in my life in a very real way, practical way, for that to happen. I had one of the best summers of my life. I finished reading the Bible cover to cover in Ireland. At this point in time, the Jim Jones Guyana thing just happened, where people had committed suicide by drinking the Kool-Aid. I didn't want to be one of those people. I didn't want to be taught something that was inerrant. And I knew I had to read the book for myself so I could understand it, so I knew when people were teaching wrong things. That was an amazing trip. I turned 25 in England that summer. A hard part about me leaving was my son was 3 years old. His mom was a heroin addict. She lived with her mom, and her mom took care of my son. There's a passage in scripture that says, you need to love me more than your wife or your children. I read that before I decided to go on this trip, and God spoke to me. He said, do you love me more than your wife and your children? Now, I wasn't married to this woman. It was hard. It was hard to leave an infant alone with somebody who was incapable of raising him. He was fine when I got back. I was able to pour him into his life. He just died last year. He was 40 years old. He died in a car wreck. So my life changed. I had gone on this missions trip. I started dating a girl that I met in my college Bible study. She wasn't real thrilled that I had a child. I was 8 years older than her. Her parents weren't real thrilled that she was dating a guy that was 8 years older than her with a child. But I ended up marrying her. And I thought that I had married the woman of my dreams. My life was turning around. I had started a company, a carpet cleaning company, when I was 24. So I had to close that down on this missions trip also. People said I was foolish. But when God speaks to you, we need to be obedient, even if it sounds outlandish. When God asks you to do something, Micah says, obedience is better than sacrifice. So I needed to be obedient. I didn't understand how it would all work out, but I knew that God was calling me higher, and He calls all of us higher if we're obedient to the Holy Spirit's prompting in our lives. And He's going to ask you to do outlandish stuff. If we're obedient, that is what I call the sweet spot in life. When we're doing God's will and you can see His hand at work and you get to participate in it. That's living, my friends. Christianity is not for cowards. It's for the strong of heart. And that's why He says in His Word, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with you wherever you go. That's a truism, friends. God is with us wherever we go. I didn't know that as a child. Even through the difficulties I was experiencing, through the car wreck, through the drug addiction, through the alcoholism, through the womanizing. God was setting me up for success because of all these failures. I knew that I couldn't find peace in drugs. I knew that I couldn't find solace in alcoholism. I knew that that temporary moment of joy you have when you're with a woman doesn't last. Those are not lasting things. The peace of God that passes understanding is available to us. That if you're a Christian, it should be the most exciting thing you can possibly be, because God is always challenging us to do more for Him, to take steps in directions we think we can't. I got married to this beautiful Christian woman, and I thought literally that I had reached the pinnacle of what my life could be and should be. I was happily married. I owned a business. I was financially well off. We lived in a beautiful Victorian in downtown Lodi. We had 3 children, Hope, Hudson, and Grace. Hope because we were hoping for a child. We had been married 5 years before we had her. Hudson because I was a fan of missions, so I read books on missionaries. Hudson Taylor was a missionary to inland China. He was the first to go inland into China, and he had a huge impact. He literally converted thousands of Chinese folks to Christianity. He learned several dialects, and I thought it's important to give a child a name that means something. And I thought Hudson Taylor was a great man of God, and I wanted my child to be a great man of God also. And then we had a third child, Grace Elizabeth, because God gave us enough grace to have another child. I was happily married. My business is going well. And then Shortly after that, my wife files for divorce. To this day, I still don't know why she wanted a divorce. I'm sure I had something to do with it, but I didn't see it coming. She was my best friend. She was the woman that I had always dreamed of. I spiraled into a deep depression. The first time in my life I'd ever been depressed. Came to a point where I was having panic attacks. My life was crumbling, and I didn't know what to do. But I did know that I couldn't find happiness or joy in alcohol, drugs, or women. So I thought, okay, God, I've always wanted to do missions work. So even though I don't trust you, and I barely believe in you right now, I'm still going to be obedient. So I did 5 missions trips to Ecuador with a friend of mine named Brad Vanderham, who ran Sunshine Ministries. It's a houseboat ministry out on the Delta and up in Shasta and Lake Havasu. He was my mentor. I met with him every other week for almost 20 years. Prior to him, I had mentioned my Bible study leader named Tim Hall. I met with Tim weekly for about 10 years. So 30 years almost of my life to the point where Brad died. I was being mentored weekly or bi-weekly by godly men. I suggest this to all of you. Find somebody you can be accountable to for a successful Christian walk. We can't do it alone. We are part of a family, God's family. And the more we connect, the stronger we are. There's a synergistic effect that takes place in our Christian walk when we're in community. So I did Ecuador, I did Nicaragua, Guatemala, Cambodia, Uganda. I spent a good portion of my 30s doing missions work, and I never asked for a penny from anybody. My business was able to allow me the freedom to be able to do that, and I enjoyed those trips. It is at that point that I found out that we all have spiritual gifts. My spiritual gifts, one of them happens to be evangelism. I love sharing God's word wherever I'm at. But just because you have a gift doesn't mean you're good at it. You have to hone that skill. You think of any athlete that's good at what they do, has a natural talent, but they still have to work at that talent. And so for me, I knew that I had the gift of evangelism early on in my Christian walk. I wanted to tell everybody. So I studied Billy Graham crusade evangelism material. I did Evangelism Explosion and became a trainer for Evangelism Explosion. During this part of my life also, I thought that I'd study theology. So I'm studying missiology, I'm studying theology, I'm studying Christology, I'm also studying demonology. I went to theological conventions. Thank you, R.C. Sproul.
Oh, we knew you would do it. No. The text tells us that at that moment, they became very much afraid.
When my wife left me, I spun into the spiral and I did missions work. I wanted to be close to God. I wanted to feel that intimacy with my Father once again, and it seemed so distant to me. Someone said, I pray and the prayers don't get past the ceiling. I knew what it was like to have an intimate relationship with Christ. I knew what it felt like to feel His blessing. One author wrote a book called The Dark Night of the Soul, and that's where I was at in my journey. Scripture also tells us the same sufferings that Christ suffers, we shall also suffer. And did not Christ say on the cross, my God, why have thou forsaken me? I felt forsaken by my Father. But I knew there was no solace anywhere else. I knew that there was nowhere else to turn except to be obedient to the calling that God had put in front of me in my life. So I traveled around the world. I've been on 5 of the 7 continents doing missions work. I still feel like God is distant from me. I find solace in the prophets, Isaiah the weeping prophet, and others. All of them have experienced some kind of moment of distance with God. Even King David said, as a deer pants for water, my soul thirsts for you. I hunger for you, God. There are times in our Christian walk when we'll go through a dark place. That doesn't mean that God has left you. That means that God is teaching you something. to be more reliant on Him, to trust in Him with all your heart. He has a plan. You might not know what it is, but He will reveal it to you in time. So I had time in my hands. I wasn't married. I had my kids half the time. I needed to fill up my time with other productive things. So I go through the Leadership Lodi class, learning about government. At that point, the mayor of our city, Lodi, John Beckman, and I had been friends for quite some time. I was his little brother's Sunday school teacher. John knew who I was. He knew that I was interested in politics. He appointed me to the Planning Commission. My first meeting on the Planning Commission, I wasn't there 3 minutes and they had nominated me vice chair. Halfway through my first year, the chair of the Planning Commission, a guy named Eddie Aguirre, dear friend of mine, passed away. So now I'm chair. I fill out his term and I do another term. So for a year and a half, I was the chairman of the Planning Commission in Lodi. That was really my introduction to politics, not knowing that God had a plan. I meet a lady, we start dating, we end up getting married. She has 2 children and I have 3. They were all very young. So we needed a bigger house. We couldn't live in the 3-bedroom house I owned. So we had to sell that and move to a house. Unfortunately, we couldn't find a 6-bedroom house in Lodi that we could afford. So we moved to Stockton. I had to resign from the Planning Commission. But a guy named Albert Holman was a council member in Stockton. And Albert decided to appoint me to the Water Advisory Board in Stockton to help get the Delta Water Supply Project running. Another learning curve, learning about water in our region, not knowing that God had something greater in store for me. I was obedient to that until we decided that we were going to move back into Lodi. Our 2 oldest had gone away to college and we could downsize. So we moved back to Lodi because all of our friends and all of our connections and all of our commitments were really still in Lodi, the church we belonged to and whatnot. So we moved back to Lodi. The dynamic of the family has changed. 2 are out of the house. For those of you who have blended families, pray over your family. Pray, pray, pray. Connect with the kids on a level that they understand. My stepkids hated me for the longest time. Now I think we're very good friends. And I think that they would say the same thing. But in this journey of blending a family and being involved in politics, I noticed that my son Hudson was struggling. And he came to me one day, right after he graduated from high school, and he said, "Dad, I've devised 6 or 7 different ways I could kill myself." My wife, being a nurse, said we needed to respond to this. It's crisis time, and we need to do something right away. I called our family doctor, who's a personal friend as well. He gave me some instructions, and my wife. We took him to county mental health. I admitted him. It's a 72-hour hold on a 5150. After the 72 hours, he was not ready to leave. They were still doing some psychiatric evaluation, trying to figure out the right meds that he should be on, but he requested a Bible. For me, that was huge. We visited him almost daily. The meds did load. He felt comfortable enough to come home. He stayed with me and our family until he passed away. It's a little bit hard for me to share. He was stabilizing out, but he wanted to still live at our house. He didn't want to go back to his mom's house. As I was saying, my wife's birthday is at the middle of August. Our anniversary is towards the end, and my birthday is all the way at the end of August. And we had planned to take a trip. We were going to go whitewater rafting down the Grand Canyon starting at Moab, Utah. And so it was a week-long trip. We came back. 3 days later, he committed suicide. He had the wherewithal to not do it in our home. It was around the corner. He found a beautiful oak tree. Hudson was an amazing kid. Brilliant. Mensa smart. Didn't have to study for tests and he'd ace them. What he was struggling with was something he couldn't escape, his own brain. The problem was in his head. Literally, the neurons weren't firing properly. They were in the wrong receptors. However your doctor wants to describe it to you, that's how I've heard it described. One of the hardest things I've ever done in my life is to go home that evening after we discovered that he had hung himself and to tell his siblings that we're home and then call his other two siblings. As a parent and teaching parenting classes, one of the goals is that your kids are each other's best friends. I was able to accomplish that with my children. My oldest daughter and Hudson were literally best friends. She invited him to her prom and set him up with one of her girlfriends so we'd have a date. She loved him so much. They were inseparable. The relationship they had, they would finish each other's sentences. My youngest daughter also had a very good relationship with her older brother. And when my oldest daughter went away to college, that relationship grew. And it was amazing to see how connected my kids were to one another and how protective they were of one another. And that was growing also in the form of their step siblings, how they were connected. And at Hudson's memorial service, over 1,000 people showed up. I found it a bit odd after the third person said that Hudson was his best friend, or her best friend. But when the seventh person came up and said that Hudson was their best friend, I knew that I had a very unique child. 3 days prior to his death, I had a conversation with him. And I told him, I named him Hudson Taylor because I knew he was going to have an impact on the world much greater than I would have. Even though I had traveled on 5 continents doing missions work, I was convinced that he would have an impact. When 1,000 people showed up to his memorial service, and as many people said that he was their best friend, I knew that my son had an impact. I didn't realize how great it was until his younger sister, my daughter Grace, said, I thought everybody heard voices. She was struggling with a mental health issue as well. We took her up to UC Davis. Here's a travesty in our county. We don't have enough mental health professionals, and especially for youth. The one facility that does take youth in San Joaquin County had a 2-week wait. She was suicidal. We didn't have 2 weeks. We got her up in the UC Davis Mind Institute. They saw her right away. And I can tell you, and I'm thrilled to tell you this, she graduated from college. She's in a healthy relationship. She's getting married next year. Not only has she overcome, but she is now thriving. She has a great job in the industry she wanted to be in. I can't tell you how happy I am for her. But if it wouldn't have been for my son's death, we wouldn't have discovered where she was at. His death saved her life. When we talk about sorrowful things in our lives, look for those God things. God is working in us and through us. So many people I know who've lost a child, their marriages fall apart. They do the blame game. Instead of looking up, God, what do you want to show me? What do I need to learn? How can I help? We help others through the pain we've gone through because we know what it's like, and then we can speak life into other people. After my son died, my wife and I, unknowingly that God would bring this ministry to us, literally hundreds of people over a 2-3 year period after my son's death would come to us, call us, text us, write us, asking for help. How do I handle my husband who suffers with depression? How do I handle our daughter who's suffering with depression? My wife and I met with so many people and have been able to speak into other people's lives through the life lessons we learned with Hudson's mental health problem. So that happened in my life. Hudson passed away 2 months before I won my first political victory as a council member in Lodi. I was not able to walk precincts, hand out flyers. I wasn't even able to go to meetings. And yet somehow God's timing was right. I won that election. I was the third highest vote getter, and there were 3 seats open. There's another learning curve again for me. How to run a $750 million budget for a city. Now, again, I've said I've been a businessman. Larry Burkett, I was one of the people that I kind of followed as a young man, as a young entrepreneur. Dave Ramsey is currently the guy that is speaking out on how to manage money well. I took those principles to our city council. Some changes needed to be made in our budget. The last 2 years I was on council, we had budget surplus. That's not because I'm brilliant. It's because I'm trying to be obedient to what God has taught me through others that are much wiser than me. And when I was mayor, some of the life lessons I learned as a youth, the teasing I received as a child, came in handy. I realized that people can be mean, but that doesn't deter me from being a man of God. There's a passage in Colossians 3:23 that says, "Whatever you do, do unto the Lord and not unto men." And this helped me quite a bit. That teasing, I remembered that they're just people, and they're hurting too. And I just need to be kind and gentle. And as I had said, I'd been in business for over 40 years, and one of the mantras that I have in business is, "Whatever you do, do unto the Lord and not unto men." That helped me quite a bit. So when I'm making decisions as a leader of a city, it's not easy during those times, as you could imagine. It didn't matter what you did as an elected, most of the population wasn't going to agree with you. But I knew that I had to be honest and true to what God had taught me. So one of the things that helped during that time for me personally was picking a woman to be married to that would be a source of encouragement, that would help me live out the dreams that God had placed in front of me. I remember doing a daily devotional, and it said that we can dream big, and whatever we dream or imagine, God could do more. I never imagined myself as an elected. I never imagined myself becoming a mayor, but God did. And if we're obedient to walking in the path that God puts in front of us, He can do more than we ask or imagine, because He's God. Some of the other things that helped me when I was being a mayor that I learned in Youth for Christ 35 years earlier. There's 5 things that really had set me up for success, and that's found in Luke 2:52. Emotional health, number 1. Most of us, according to a book I read by M. Scott Peck called The Road Less Traveled, says that about 80 to 85% of us have the maturity level of a 14-year-old or less. So most of us, if you're anything like me, we need to grow up emotionally. The next one is social. We have to have a social life. We have to interact with others and be healthy in community. And those are things that it's a skill set we develop. But if we ignore that, we don't have that balanced life that so many of us desperately need. Physical. We have to work out. We have to stay active. We have to stay fit. That helps with a variety of different ways, endorphin levels and serotonin levels. And if we're not being physically active, we're missing out on having a healthy whole life. Mental. If we're not mentally astute and mentally being challenged and mentally growing, we're depriving ourselves. That's why I have read so many books in my lifetime. I'm always trying to stretch and grow. And spiritually, last but not least, if we're not connected with the Holy Spirit, not just reading your Bible, but studying the Bible. And these are where those Ligonier conferences on theology really had helped my cause. So, in summary, to have a healthy whole life and become strong and courageous and do the things that God puts in front of you, because He can do more than we ask or imagine. I ran for office again this last ran for office and won unchallenged, ran for office the third time and lost. This time, I had lost another son. The one I had mentioned, he was 40 years old and died in a car wreck. So at this point in my life, I've lost 2 of my boys. My family lineage, the last name, will not be carried on, through me anyway. And you think, how did Doug get to be so lucky to lose 2 kids? It's a pretty elite group. I don't recommend you join it. But there's lessons even in this last son's death. I will say this about my life. It's had some interesting twists and turns, and that's how I started this video. My life has gone places, and I've done things that I never thought that I would accomplish. But through God, He can do more than we ask or imagine when we're obedient to Him. We can make it through the difficulties in life. We can attain great heights for His glory when we're honoring Him. We can have a handful of fantastic God moments in our life when we're obedient. I don't know where my life will take me next, but I can't wait to find out what God has in store for me. When we love Jesus Christ with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love our neighbors as ourselves, God can work miracles. He's done it in my life. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my testimony.
If you have a supernatural encounter that you would like to share on camera, please visit supernaturalencounter.com to submit your testimony.